Hello students, teachers, parents, history nerds. Hello everybody and welcome to Nutshelled History, where we lay out the facts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today we are going to continue our United States history series by looking at World War II. Don't forget that there's a link for a fill-in-the-blanks worksheet in the description. I just ask that you like and subscribe. I apologize for any mispronunciations ahead of time. I do my best. Okay, let's start with the rise of aggressive dictators. In the 1920s, while some countries were giving democracy a try, like it was the latest political trend, others were busy flirting with repressive dictatorships and totalitarianism. That's the type of government where one party or leader runs the show and micromanages everything from the economy down to what you can and can't say at dinner. The Soviet Union got things rolling in 1917 with its communist revolution, creating the first totalitarian state under Vladimir Lenin. Then, in 1924, Joseph Stalin stepped up to take over, and let's just say, the USSR got a lot more intense. Meanwhile, over in Italy, things weren't exactly sunny. After a post-war economic slump, the king decided that Benito Mussolini, founder of the fascist party, might be the man to fix things. Mussolini took the job and swiftly turned Italy into a fascist state, complete with a censored press, secret police, and absolutely no political parties, because why share power when you can hog it? Post-World War I, Germany thought democracy sounded like a good idea, but the Great Depression of the 1930s hit like a ton of bricks. Enter the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, who blamed just about everyone for Germany's problems, but focused his rage particularly on communists and Jews. Hitler's anti-Semitism was especially vicious, and by 1933, he was appointed chancellor. Within 2 years, he had taken over as president, too. Because why settle for one job? In Japan, the Great Depression brought an end to a brief period of democracy and peace. Military leaders, thinking why not expand and fix our problems at the same time, decided to conquer their way across Asia. They started with Manchuria in 1931, and later, in 1937, attacked China with such cruelty in the capital that it became known as the Rape of Nanjing. By the 1930s, Italy and Germany had joined Japan in their aggressive expansion plans. Hitler grabbed the Saar region from French control and marched troops into the Rhineland like he was just taking a stroll. Meanwhile, Mussolini decided to invade Ethiopia because why not? The League of Nations, whose job was to keep the peace, pretty much stood by and watched, like a referee too afraid to blow the whistle. France, Britain, and the US decided to go with appeasement, which is a fancy way of saying, let's just give these guys a little bit of what they want so they don't start a fight. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. It only made the dictators more confident and a lot more aggressive. America debates involvement. After Japan's not-so-subtle smackdown on China in 1937, President Roosevelt called out the aggression like a referee blowing a whistle, but the U.S. still backed away from foreign conflicts faster than someone avoiding eye contact at a party. In 1939, despite a solid, we've got your back pact between France, Britain, and Poland, Germany rolled into Poland like an uninvited guest. Britain and France responded with a war declaration, and just like that, World War II was underway. Germany, Italy, Japan, and a few other countries formed the Axis powers, while Britain, France, and later the Soviet Union, China, and eventually the US teamed up as the Allies. Germany wasn't messing around either. They unleashed their shiny new war strategy, the Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war, and it was as fast and destructive as it sounds. Tanks and planes tag-teamed to conquer Poland, and by April 1940, Denmark and Norway had fallen. Germany then checked off the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France like they were ticking items off a grocery list. Next on the agenda, bombing Britain from the air. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, not one to back down from a fight, was eager to get the US off the sidelines. News reporter Edward R. Murrow's gripping broadcasts about the bombing of London shocked Americans, especially when he pointed out that the Germans were targeting civilians, not military sites. Slowly but surely, the U.S. began inching toward involvement, passing the Neutrality Act of 1939, which allowed the Allies to buy goods and munitions from the U.S., but no personal involvement, just yet. Isolationists back home still thought jumping into a European mess was risky business. Even though most Americans were waving their neutrality flags, President Roosevelt kept nudging them toward helping Britain. By early 1941, Congress finally passed the Lend-Lease Act, giving Roosevelt the power to basically become Britain's weapons supplier, whether by selling, giving, or leasing. That same year, Roosevelt met up with Churchill for a little "how's the war going" chat, and they signed the Atlantic Charter, which promoted the idea of national self-determination and a global system of general security. In other words, they were besties now. Hitler, of course, wasn't oblivious to the US playing favorites with the Allies. By fall 1941, he'd had enough and ordered German U-boats to start sinking American ships. At that point, US involvement in the war wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. The United States enters World War II. As Japan went on a land grab spree across Asia, its relationship with the United States got about as awkward as a bad breakup. Japan desperately needed oil, steel, and rubber to keep its military running, but the US wasn't about to play supplier for its empire-building hobby. So the US began cutting off the goods, eventually slapping a full trade embargo on Japan like a giant no-entry sign. At first, Japan's Prime Minister, Hideki Tojo, tried to smooth things over with the US, hoping to keep them out of the fight. But when trade talks collapsed, Tojo went from "let's negotiate" to "let's blow things up pretty fast." On December 7, 1941, hundreds of Japanese planes launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, catching the US with its guard down. The result? Nearly 2,500 dead, a bunch of ships sunk, and a lot of wrecked planes. Basically, the worst surprise party ever. Congress didn't waste any time and declared war on Japan, and like the world's worst tag team, Germany and Italy immediately declared war on the US in return. George Marshall, the US Army's Chief of Staff, got right to work on ramping up the military, while men from all walks of life rushed to enlist. Women weren't left out either. Thousands joined the Women's Army Corps, WAC, taking on jobs like clerks, truck drivers, and even lab technicians. The government whipped up new agencies to make sure the military had everything it needed, while private companies churned out war supplies in what felt like an industrial miracle. Turns out, nothing motivates production like a world war. Over in Asia, US General Douglas MacArthur was having a rough time holding off the Japanese in the Philippines. US forces had to retreat, and MacArthur famously said, "I shall return," as he evacuated to Australia in March. Meanwhile, 70,000 American and Filipino troops were stuck on the Bataan Peninsula, surviving on rations that would make a diet look like a feast. By April 1942, they had no choice but to surrender. The captured troops were then forced on a brutal trek known as the Bataan Death March, where over 7,000 of them died. The citadel on Corregidor Island held out until May 1942, but soon after, Japan had full control of the Philippines. By the summer of 1942, Japan had claimed most of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. But their winning streak came to a halt in May 1942 at the Battle of Coral Sea, when the U.S. Navy finally managed to stop Japan from grabbing New Guinea. The Japanese offensive had officially hit a wall, and the tide of the war was starting to turn. A war on two fronts. The attack on Pearl Harbor was like a rude awakening, and suddenly the U.S. was all in on World War II. The Allies had a big task ahead, a two-front war, but first things first. They had to deal with Hitler, because no one likes a dictator who crashes the party. The US cranked out guns, tanks, and supplies like it was having the ultimate wartime Black Friday sale. But German U-boats were party poopers, sinking more than 3,500 merchant ships headed for Britain. By mid-1943, though, the Allies were sinking those U-boats faster than Germany could build them, thanks to radar, bombers, and some very persuasive underwater depth charges. The Allies were finally making waves in the North Atlantic, pun intended. Meanwhile, in 1941, Hitler thought it would be a great idea to invade Russia. Pro tip, not a great idea, and Stalin wasn't too happy about it. He asked Roosevelt and Churchill to open a second front in France, but instead of a full invasion, the Brits started saturation bombing, which sounds like an aggressive car wash, but involved dropping tons of bombs on German cities. American bombers, on the other hand, went for strategic bombing, targeting key political and industrial centers. The Tuskegee Airmen, an all-African-American fighter squadron, became stars of the show, proving their skills and changing the course of the bombing campaign. In January 1943, after the brutal Battle of Stalingrad, the Russians gave Hitler the cold shoulder, literally and figuratively, turning back his invasion. Around the same time, FDR made it clear that the Axis powers weren't getting any consolation prizes. They'd need to surrender unconditionally, or not at all. Talk about tough love. Meanwhile, to prep for the Italian job, the Allies figured they should kick the Germans out of North Africa, where they'd been squabbling with British forces since 1940. In February 1942, American General Dwight Eisenhower led the charge, and after a few rough battles, General George S. Patton Jr. took over American forces. By May 1943, the Germans and Italians in North Africa threw in the towel, surrendering. With that done, the Allies invaded Sicily in July, just a hop, skip, and 2 miles away from mainland Italy. By September, Italy had surrendered, probably deciding it wasn't worth all the fuss. Even though the US was focused on Europe, it didn't forget about the Pacific. Japanese forces were still on the move, so in June 1942, they tried to take Midway, a critical American naval base. But Admiral Chester Nimitz was one step ahead. He knew their plans. The Battle of Midway turned into a decisive victory for the US, effectively putting an end to Japanese expansion and forcing Japan onto the defensive. In the Pacific, the tables were turning faster than you could say sayonara. The home front, World War II wasn't just about battles and bombs. It was also a major test of civil liberties and a giant shuffle of who did what in society at home in the US. For women, it was a bit of a plot twist. Suddenly, they found themselves with jobs in heavy industry, wielding tools, gaining new skills, and bonus, getting a paycheck. Who knew the factory floor could be so empowering? However, African Americans weren't as lucky in finding jobs, especially in defense. A. Philip Randolph, an African American labor leader, wasn't having it. He planned a march on Washington, basically saying, "If you're not going to let us in, we'll bring the protest to your doorstep." Under pressure, FDR quickly whipped out Executive Order 8802, which was basically his way of saying, okay, fair hiring in any government-funded job. Meanwhile, the South and Southwest became hotspots for defense jobs, prompting people to pack up and head for the sun. To keep farms running while everyone was off chasing defense dollars, the U.S. launched the Bracero program, which brought Mexican laborers to work the fields. Though the Braceros faced their share of discrimination, they played a huge role in keeping the agricultural gears turning during the war. Things took a dark turn after Pearl Harbor when the federal government, in a mix of paranoia and poor judgment, rounded up about 100,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast and sent them to internment camps. These camps were like summer camp, but with way more barbed wire and way fewer s'mores. Some Japanese Americans took their case to court, but in 1944, the Supreme Court sided with the government in Korematsu v. United States, giving the internment policy the legal thumbs up. Despite this injustice, when the government lifted the ban on Japanese Americans serving in the military, many enlisted. The Japanese American 4th and 42nd Regimental Combat Team went on to fight in Italy and became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. Talk about turning the tables. As for the war itself, it came with a hefty price tag, $330 billion. Congress figured the best way to foot the bill was by taxing everyone who had a job. On top of that, rationing became the new normal. Rubber and oil, you better believe those were going straight to the war effort. The Office of War Information, OWI, teamed up with the media to get people fired up about the war effort, and millions of Americans pitched in by buying war bonds or chipping in any way they could. The home front became a war zone of support, but with way more fundraising and fewer grenades. The Allies win the war. In 1943, the Allied leaders finally agreed to give Hitler the two-front headache he'd been dreading by opening a second front in France. Fast forward to June 6, 1944. D-Day. British and American forces hopped across the English Channel in a not-so-casual invasion of France. bringing along 11,000 planes and over 4,400 ships and landing crafts. You could say it was the world's least subtle surprise party. By the end of the day, the Allies had a solid grip on French soil. Fast forward a little more, and by July 1st, more than 1 million troops had touched down. Hitler was probably not thrilled. Now Germany had itself a classic two-front war nightmare. With the Soviets charging in from the east and the Allies squeezing from the west, things were looking grim for old Adolf. Still, Hitler wasn't going down without one last tantrum. In December 1944, he launched a surprise counterattack, hoping to pull off a miracle in what's now known as the Battle of the Bulge. It almost worked, but the Allies, with the help of some timely bombers, pushed the Germans right back where they came from. By January 1945, the Soviets were camping out by the Oder River just outside Berlin, and in April, the US Army was chilling 50 miles to the west. Realizing the jig was up, Hitler opted for the exit stage left plan on April 30th by committing suicide. Less than a week later, on May 7th, Germany officially surrendered. Cue the confetti. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the US was busy island hopping its way through the Pacific toward Japan. The Japanese fought fiercely, with kamikaze pilots literally crashing into American ships like it was a demolition derby. By April 1945, American forces reached Okinawa, just 340 miles from Japan. From there, US bombers could practically knock on Japan's door. American bombers soon rained down on factories, military bases, and cities. But it wasn't just firepower that was pushing the war toward its dramatic conclusion. Technology played a starring role too. Albert Einstein, the most famous hair in science, tipped off FDR about the need for atomic research. Enter physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project, which, spoiler alert, was not about real estate. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was tested, and it made quite the impression. President Harry S. Truman, looking to wrap up the war and save lives, decided to use this new superweapon. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and 3 days later, another one on Nagasaki. That was enough for Emperor Hirohito, who promptly surrendered. On August 15th, the Allies celebrated VJ Day, victory in Japan, and World War II officially came to an end. It was the most expensive war in history, not just in dollars, but in lives. As many as 60 million people, mostly civilians, had lost their lives. World War II left a big mark on the world, and quite a few history textbooks. The Holocaust. In 1945, the world had not yet found a word to capture the full horror of the Holocaust, the darkest chapter of World War II. It was the Nazis' calculated and relentless attempt to exterminate the Jewish people, along with others they deemed undesirable. This atrocity was rooted in a twisted, racist ideology that held Aryans, white Northern European Gentiles, as superior to all others. From the moment Hitler seized power, the persecution of Jews began. The 1935 Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of their citizenship and isolated them from society. Violence against Jewish communities escalated. One of the most brutal nights of terror occurred on November 9, 1938, a night remembered as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. During this pogrom, Nazi secret police and military units destroyed over 200 synagogues, shattered 500 Jewish businesses, and left more than 200 Jews dead and over 600 injured. The culmination of Hitler's brutal campaign against the Jewish people came in what he called the final solution to the Jewish question. It was genocide, an attempt to wipe out every Jewish person in the territories controlled by the Nazis. Jews, along with others deemed undesirable, were forced into concentration camps, places that, in theory, were meant to re-educate prisoners into useful members of the Third Reich. In reality, these camps were sites of unimaginable cruelty. The guards, unchecked in their authority, tortured and killed at will. In some camps, doctors performed grotesque experiments, leaving prisoners dead or permanently disfigured. Many concentration camps were death camps, where mass extermination was the goal. The most infamous of these was Auschwitz, in southern Poland, a place that stands as a symbol of human suffering and the depths of inhumanity. The impact of the war. Before the war, the US and other countries missed a golden opportunity to be a little more welcoming by relaxing immigration policies and taking in more Jewish refugees. But hey, hindsight's 2020, right? Once the war was in full swing, rumors of mass killings started trickling in, and by early 1944, FDR finally decided to do something about it. He set up the War Refugee Board, which worked with the Red Cross to save thousands of Eastern European Jews. Unfortunately, it wasn't until Allied soldiers started liberating concentration camps that most Americans really grasped the scale of the horror. Once the reality of the Holocaust hit home, support for a Jewish homeland skyrocketed. So, when Jewish settlers in Palestine declared the creation of Israel, President Truman wasted no time. He recognized the new state like it was the grand opening of a new diner. As World War II dragged on, Japan and Germany kept fighting long after it was clear their goose was cooked. This gave the Allies some extra time to huddle up and plan for the post-war world. In February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin gathered at Yalta, yes, on the Black Sea. Nothing says war planning like a scenic seaside locale, to discuss final strategies and who got what after the war. A few months later, the Big Three met again at Potsdam, but with Truman and Attlee joining Stalin, because apparently, world domination plans need rotating hosts. There, they agreed to slice Germany into 4 occupation zones. And just like that, Western European dominance was over, and 2 superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, emerged to run the global show. Of course, not everything went according to the Yalta and Potsdam game plan. Communist and anti-communist interests were already bickering in Eastern Europe, China's civil war picked up where it left off, and Japan, under American occupation, got itself a brand new constitution, no more armed forces, and a crash course in democracy. Meanwhile, the US, whose economy was running like a well-oiled machine during the war, decided to lead the charge in shaping the post-war economy. Oh, and they helped launch the United Nations, no big deal. The UN was built on the Great Powers Foundation, but everyone got a seat in the General Assembly. Think of it as the world's biggest group project. In 1948, the UN even issued the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, condemning things like slavery and torture, and throwing in the right to a decent standard of living. Just the basics. During the war, the Axis powers didn't exactly play by the rules of the Geneva Convention, which is supposed to ensure humane treatment of wounded soldiers and prisoners. So more than 1,000 Japanese were tried for war crimes, and at the Nuremberg trials, the big bads of Nazi Germany faced the music for crimes against humanity. Americans, having followed the war closely, started seeing themselves as democratic, tolerant, and peaceful, despite the occasional hiccup in civil rights. The war didn't just give the U.S. global street cred, it kick-started an era of economic growth and prosperity that would make the post-war years feel like hitting the jackpot after a long, tough fight. Okay, to recap, in the 1920s and 1930s, while some nations leaned toward democracy, others embraced dictatorships, leading to the rise of totalitarian regimes. The Soviet Union established the first totalitarian state under Lenin and intensified under Stalin. Italy followed with Mussolini's fascist rule, and Germany turned to Adolf Hitler after the Great Depression. Japan, influenced by its military, pursued expansion across Asia, resulting in horrific events like the rape of Nanjing. As dictatorships became aggressive, the world edged toward conflict, with Britain, France, and the US initially opting for appeasement. However, after Germany invaded Poland in 1939, World War II erupted. The US remained neutral until Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. The war saw the Allies fighting on 2 fronts, in Europe against Nazi Germany and in the Pacific against Japan. The US contributed significantly to both fronts, eventually achieving victory in Europe by 1945 and in the Pacific after dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war reshaped global power, led to the formation of the United Nations, and highlighted the horrors of the Holocaust. The aftermath saw the rise of the US and Soviet Union as superpowers and ushered in a period of economic growth and global realignment. There you have it, folks. That is World War II nutshelled. Thanks for stopping by Nutshelled History. Don't forget to go a little nuts on those like and subscribe buttons for me. Say hi in the comments down below. See y'all next time on Nutshelled History.